At my daughter's wedding reception, my ex-husband's new wife stood up during my speech and announced loud enough for everyone to hear, "That's not a mother. That's a pathetic woman living in the past." The guests gasped, my daughter looked mortified, but my ex-husband just sat there with a smug smile on his face. What they didn't know was that the past they were mocking was about to become their worst nightmare, because the next morning, everything they'd built their perfect life on would come crashing down. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button. Now, let me tell you how we got to this spectacular moment of karma. Because, honey, this story is about as satisfying as justice gets. 8 months before that glorious implosion of a wedding reception, I was living my carefully reconstructed life in Portland, Oregon, thinking my biggest challenge was deciding which art gallery opening to attend on Friday nights. At 58, I'd rebuilt myself from the ground up after my divorce 10 years earlier, working as a freelance art consultant while quietly building a career that most people in my social circle knew nothing about. What they didn't know was that my modest consulting work was covering for something much more substantial. My daughter Emma had been engaged to this wonderful man named David for about 6 months, and I'd been genuinely happy for her until she announced that her father, my ex-husband Richard, would be walking her down the aisle alongside his new wife, Vanessa. Not just attending the wedding, but actively participating in the ceremony like they were some kind of blended family success story. The first time I met Vanessa was at Emma's engagement party, where she made her entrance wearing what I suspected was a $3,000 designer dress and enough jewelry to fund a small country's annual budget. She was 15 years younger than Richard, which meant she was actually closer to Emma's age than mine, a fact that nobody seemed to find awkward except me. "Catherine," she'd said, air kissing me like we were long-lost sorority sisters. "I've heard so much about you. Richard says you were quite the artist back in the day. How sweet that you still dabble in the art world." Dabble. That word hung in the air like an insult wrapped in condescension. Here I was, being patted on the head by a woman who'd married my ex-husband for his money and was now pretending to be interested in my quaint little hobbies. If she only knew that my dabbling in the art world had resulted in a private collection worth approximately $12 million, accumulated through 20 years of careful acquisitions and strategic sales that I'd kept completely separate from my marriage and divorce. Richard stood beside Vanessa looking prosperous and self-satisfied in his expensive suit, the very picture of a successful corporate attorney who'd traded in his first wife for a newer model and never looked back. "Catherine's always had good taste," he said with that patronizing smile I'd learned to hate during our marriage. Even if she never quite figured out how to monetize it. The implication was clear. I was the artistic dreamer who'd never understood practical matters like money and success, while he was the financial genius who'd built our comfortable life through his legal career. What he didn't know was that I'd been building my own fortune while he was busy billing hours and having affairs with his paralegals. Emma, caught between her divorced parents and trying to keep the peace, had smiled brightly and changed the subject to wedding plans. My daughter had inherited my artistic sensibility, but her father's desire for social approval, which meant this wedding was going to be an elaborate production designed to showcase the Harper family success story. The second meeting with Vanessa came when she invited me to lunch to discuss, as she put it, coordination of family responsibilities for the wedding. We met at an upscale restaurant downtown, the kind of place where the menu doesn't list prices and the waiters treat you like royalty if you look expensive enough. Vanessa had arrived early and selected a prominent table where everyone could see her designer outfit and perfect manicure. "Catherine," she'd begun, once we'd ordered salads that cost more than most people's entire lunch budget, "I want us to be on the same page about the wedding. Emma is very important to Richard and me, and we want everything to be perfect for her special day." Us, like she and Richard, were a unified parental unit, and I was some kind of auxiliary family member who needed to be managed. "Of course," I said, taking a sip of overpriced sparkling water. "Emma's happiness is what matters most." "Exactly," Vanessa beamed. "Which is why Richard and I have decided to cover the majority of the wedding expenses. We understand that your financial situation might be more limited, and we don't want Emma to have to compromise on her vision because of budget constraints." My financial situation. I nearly laughed out loud at the assumption that I was struggling while they were generously subsidizing my daughter's wedding. "That's very thoughtful," I managed to say. "Richard has always been successful," Vanessa continued, clearly warming to her subject. "His law practice brings in substantial income, and my family's investments have been quite profitable. We're in a position to give Emma the wedding she deserves." The subtext was unmistakable. They had money, I didn't, and I should be grateful for their generosity in allowing me to participate in my own daughter's wedding without the embarrassment of having to contribute financially. What Vanessa didn't know was that, while Richard had been building his legal career, I'd been quietly acquiring works by emerging artists who'd gone on to become major names in the contemporary art world. That painting I'd bought for $5,000 in 1998 was now worth $400,000. The sculpture I'd purchased for $8,000 in 2003 had recently been appraised at $650,000. My dabbling in the art world had turned into one of the most successful private collections in the Pacific Northwest. But here's what people like Vanessa never understand about women who have survived divorce and rebuilt their lives from scratch. We learn to be strategic about what we reveal and when we reveal it. We learn that sometimes the best defense is letting people underestimate you until the moment you choose to prove them wrong. The lunch continued with Vanessa outlining her vision for the wedding, which involved a lot of expensive details and very little input from the bride's mother. Flowers would be handled by her preferred florist. Catering would be managed by the chef from Richard's Country Club. Photography would be done by someone Vanessa had found through her social connections. My role, as she delicately explained, would be to show up, smile for pictures, and perhaps give a brief speech at the reception if I wanted to share some maternal wisdom. Nothing too long, she cautioned. We don't want to bore the guests with too many family speeches. Just something short and sweet about Emma growing up. I smiled and nodded while mentally composing exactly what kind of speech I was going to give at my daughter's wedding reception. Because Vanessa had just made the crucial mistake of assuming that quiet meant compliant and modest meant powerless. 3 weeks after that enlightening lunch, I was sitting in my art dealer's office reviewing offers on several pieces from my collection when I realized exactly how I was going to handle my ex-husband's new wife and her superior attitude. Catherine, Marcus Brennan said, adjusting his reading glasses as he reviewed the latest auction results, the Rothko study you acquired in 2005 has appreciated significantly. We have a serious buyer offering $2.3 million. I looked at the painting hanging on Marcus's office wall, a beautiful abstract that I'd purchased for $180,000 when most people thought the artist's work was overpriced. 15 years of patience had turned that investment into something extraordinary. What about the entire collection? I asked. If I wanted to liquidate everything, what kind of timeline are we looking at? Marcus raised his eyebrows. The entire collection? Catherine, are you sure? You've spent 2 decades building this portfolio. It's one of the finest private collections of contemporary art in the region. I'm not selling everything, I clarified, just exploring my options. What would the total value be at current market rates? He pulled up his database and started calculating, his fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. After several minutes, he looked up with an expression of professional appreciation. Conservative estimate, accounting for auction fees and market fluctuations, you're looking at approximately $11.8 million. If we wait for the right buyers and negotiate private sales, possibly as high as $14 million. I smiled and sipped my coffee while Marcus continued reviewing individual pieces and their projected values. While Richard and Vanessa were planning my daughter's elaborate wedding and congratulating themselves on their generous financial support, I was sitting on a fortune that would have made Richard's legal practice look like a lemonade stand. The plans started forming in my mind like a painting taking shape on canvas, each brushstroke deliberate and purposeful. Emma called that evening, voice bright with wedding excitement but tinged with the stress of managing family dynamics. Mom, I need to talk to you about the reception, she said. Vanessa has some ideas about the seating arrangements and the speech schedule. What kind of ideas? Well, she thinks it would be nice if she and Dad give a joint welcome speech since they're hosting at the country club. And then maybe you could say a few words after dinner, before the dancing starts. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Vanessa wanted to give a welcome speech at my daughter's wedding, positioning herself as the primary parental figure while I was relegated to an afterthought slot in the program. What do you think, Emma? I asked carefully. My daughter said slowly, I think I want everyone to just get along and not make this about old family drama. Vanessa is trying to be helpful, and Dad is paying for most of the wedding, so maybe we should just let them do things their way. There it was, the assumption that because Richard was paying, he got to control the narrative, the belief that I should be grateful for whatever role they allowed me to play in my own daughter's wedding. Of course, sweetheart, I said. I want your day to be perfect. I'll give whatever speech you'd like me to give. What I didn't tell Emma was that the speech I was planning would be nothing like what Vanessa expected. That evening, I called my financial advisor with a very specific request. Jennifer, I said, I want to set up a trust fund for Emma, something substantial that will give her complete financial independence. How substantial are we talking? Jennifer asked. $2 million structured so that she receives income starting immediately after her wedding, with full access to the principal when she turns 35. There was a pause. Catherine, that's a significant portion of your liquid assets. Are you sure about this timing? I've never been more sure of anything, I assured her. My daughter is about to marry into a family that values appearances over authenticity. I want her to know that she has options, that she doesn't have to depend on anyone's financial approval to live her life on her own terms. What I didn't tell Jennifer was that the trust fund was only part one of my plan. Part two involved making sure that Richard and Vanessa understood exactly what they'd been underestimating for the past 10 years. 6 weeks before the wedding, Vanessa called to invite me to what she described as a small family gathering at their home. When I arrived at the address she'd provided, I discovered that small family gathering actually meant an elaborate cocktail party with approximately 50 guests, most of whom I didn't recognize. The house was one of those modern architectural statements in the hills overlooking the city, all glass walls and expensive furniture, and the kind of studied elegance that screamed, "We hired a very expensive interior designer." Vanessa greeted me at the door wearing what I suspected was a $5,000 cocktail dress, her smile bright and welcoming in a way that felt completely artificial. "Catherine, so glad you could make it," she said, air kissing me again. "Come meet some of our friends. We're celebrating Richard's promotion to senior partner." Senior partner. Of course, Richard had finally achieved the career milestone he'd been chasing our entire marriage, and Vanessa was throwing a party to celebrate their success. I followed her into the living room, where Richard was holding court with a group of well-dressed professionals, explaining some complex legal case with the kind of animated confidence that comes from knowing you're the most important person in the room. "Catherine," he said, spotting me and waving me over. "Come meet the managing partners from the firm. Gentlemen, this is my ex-wife, Catherine. She's an art consultant." An art consultant. Like that was my entire identity, a nice little hobby that kept me busy between yoga classes and book club meetings. The managing partners nodded politely and immediately returned to their conversation about billable hours and client retention strategies. I spent the next hour circulating through the party, making small talk with people who clearly saw me as Richard's first wife, the artistic one he'd outgrown on his way to bigger and better things. Vanessa made sure to introduce me to everyone with that same condescending sweetness, always emphasizing my art consulting work like it was a charming eccentricity rather than a serious profession. That's when I overheard the conversation that sealed their fate. I was standing near the kitchen, pretending to admire a piece of mass-produced art on the wall, when I heard Vanessa talking to a group of her friends. "Richard's ex-wife is here," she was saying, her voice carrying clearly. "The poor thing is trying so hard to fit in. I think she's a bit intimidated by all this success. You know how it is with divorced women of a certain age. They get left behind while their ex-husbands move on to better things." Her friends laughed, and I felt rage bloom in my chest like a poisonous flower. Better things. Like I was some kind of inferior model that Richard had traded in for a superior replacement. "I'm trying to be nice to her for Emma's sake," Vanessa continued. "But honestly, it's exhausting dealing with someone who's so obviously bitter about how her life turned out. She's still living in that tiny apartment, still doing her little art consulting work, still pretending she's relevant." I walked away before I could hear more, my hands shaking with suppressed fury. Tiny apartment. Little art consulting work. Pretending to be relevant. Vanessa had no idea that my tiny apartment was actually a converted loft in the Pearl District that I owned outright, worth approximately $800,000. She had no idea that my little art consulting work generated enough income to live comfortably, while my investment portfolio grew exponentially. And she certainly had no idea that I was about to become very, very relevant in ways she couldn't begin to imagine. I left the party early, claiming a headache, and drove home with my mind racing through possibilities and strategies. Because Vanessa and Richard had just made the kind of mistake that people make when they've been privileged for so long they forget that other people might have resources they can't see. The next morning, I called Marcus Brennan with specific instructions. "I want to organize a private exhibition," I said. "Selected pieces from my collection, invitation only, scheduled for the week after Emma's wedding." "That's ambitious timing," Marcus said. "What's the occasion?" "Let's call it a coming out party," I replied. "I think it's time Portland's art community learned about the Catherine Harper collection." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Catherine, if you're planning what I think you're planning, this could position you as one of the major collectors in the region. The publicity alone would be substantial." "Good," I said. "I want substantial. I want unmistakable. I want everyone who's ever underestimated Catherine Harper to understand exactly what they missed. The wedding day arrived with the kind of perfect June weather that makes Portland magical, clear skies and warm temperatures, and just enough breeze to keep things comfortable. The ceremony was being held at a historic estate that Richard and Vanessa had rented for the occasion, all manicured gardens and elegant architecture, and the kind of setting that photographs beautifully. I arrived early, wearing a dress I'd selected specifically for this occasion, elegant but understated, expensive but not obviously so. The kind of outfit that wouldn't draw attention but would photograph well for the memories Emma would keep forever. Emma looked absolutely beautiful in her wedding dress, radiant and nervous and so much like the little girl I'd raised alone while Richard worked 80-hour weeks at his law firm. "Mom," she said, hugging me carefully to avoid wrinkling her dress, "thank you for being here. I know this hasn't been easy with Dad and Vanessa." "Sweetheart," I said, holding her face in my hands, "this is your day. Nothing else matters except your happiness." The ceremony was lovely, traditional, and heartfelt, with Emma and David exchanging vows that actually seemed to mean something beyond social performance. Richard walked Emma down the aisle looking proud and proprietary, while Vanessa watched from the front row wearing a dress that was almost as elaborate as the bride's. The reception was being held at Richard's country club, naturally, in the grand ballroom that Vanessa had decorated within an inch of its life. Flowers everywhere, crystal chandeliers, a band that probably cost more than most people's cars, and a guest list that read like a who's who of Portland's legal and business community. I was seated at a table near the back, not quite relegated to the overflow room, but definitely not positioned with the important guests. Richard and Vanessa had the head table, of course, along with Emma and David, and the wedding party. The message was clear about who really mattered at this event. Dinner was served, expensive and elegant, while Vanessa made sure everyone knew that she'd personally selected the menu and coordinated with the chef. Then came the speeches. David's best man spoke first, telling funny stories about their college adventures. Emma's maid of honor followed with sweet memories of their friendship. Then Richard stood up to give what he called a father's blessing, which turned into a 10-minute speech about hard work and success and building a good life through professional achievement. "Emma has always made me proud," Richard said, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom. "She inherited my work ethic and my understanding that success comes from dedication and smart choices. I know she and David will build a wonderful life together, just like Vanessa and I have built our life together." The applause was polite, and I watched Emma's face carefully. She looked uncomfortable with her father's self-congratulatory tone, but too well-mannered to show it obviously. Then Vanessa stood up, even though she hadn't been scheduled to speak, and took the microphone from Richard with a bright smile. "I just want to add," she began, "how grateful we are to welcome David into our family. Emma is like a daughter to me, and I'm so proud of the woman she's become. Like a daughter to me." I felt my jaw clench as Vanessa continued her impromptu speech about family and love and the importance of having strong role models. The implication was unmistakable. She was positioning herself as Emma's real maternal influence, the successful woman who'd shown my daughter what it meant to be sophisticated and accomplished. That's when the wedding coordinator approached my table and quietly informed me that I was scheduled to speak next if I was ready. I stood up, smoothed down my dress, and walked to the microphone with the kind of calm determination that comes from knowing you're about to change everything. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate Emma and David," I began, looking out at the assembled guests. "As Emma's mother, I've had the privilege of watching her grow into an extraordinary woman, and I'm so proud of who she's become." I paused, letting the word mother hang in the air with unmistakable emphasis. Emma's father spoke about success and hard work, which are certainly important values, but I want to talk about something different. I want to talk about authenticity and courage, and the importance of being true to yourself, even when other people try to define you by their own limited understanding. I could see Vanessa's smile becoming strained, and Richard was starting to look uncomfortable. "You see, I've spent the past 10 years rebuilding my life after my divorce, and I've learned some valuable lessons about what really matters. I've learned that success isn't about how much money you make or how impressive your title sounds. It's about building something meaningful that reflects your true values." The room had gone very quiet, and I could feel the attention shifting from polite tolerance to genuine interest. "I've also learned that people will underestimate you if you let them. They'll make assumptions about your capabilities based on their own biases and limitations. They'll mistake modesty for weakness and quiet strength for insignificance." Emma was watching me with wide eyes, probably wondering where this speech was going. "For example," I continued, Some people might look at a divorced woman working as an art consultant and assume she's struggling to make ends meet. They might feel sorry for her tiny apartment and her little art consulting work. They might even make condescending comments about how she's been left behind while others moved on to better things. Vanessa's face had gone pale, and I saw recognition dawning in her expression. She knew exactly what comments I was referencing. But what those people don't understand is that assumptions can be very, very expensive mistakes. Because that divorced woman with her little art consulting work might actually be one of the most successful art collectors in the Pacific Northwest. She might own a private collection worth approximately $12 million, dollars, accumulated through 20 years of careful acquisitions and strategic investments. The gasps that rippled through the ballroom were audible, and I watched Richard's face go from confusion to shock to something that looked like panic. She might own her apartment outright, along with several other properties that she's never bothered to mention because she doesn't need external validation to feel successful. And she might be planning a major exhibition of her collection that will position her as a significant figure in the regional art world. I turned to look directly at Emma, whose mouth had fallen open in complete surprise. Sweetheart, I have a wedding gift for you. It's not wrapped in pretty paper, but I think you'll find it useful. I've established a trust fund in your name, worth $2 million, that will provide you with financial independence for the rest of your life. You'll never have to depend on anyone else's approval or generosity to live the life you choose. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, broken only by the sound of someone dropping a fork on their plate. The reason I'm telling you this publicly, I continued, is because I want you to understand something important. Your worth isn't determined by other people's opinions of you. Your value isn't measured by how well you fit into someone else's definition of success. And you should never, ever let anyone make you feel like you're less than you are because they're too limited to see your full potential. I set the microphone down and looked at Vanessa, whose perfect makeup couldn't hide the fact that she'd just been publicly humiliated in front of Portland's social elite. Oh, and Vanessa, I added, picking the microphone back up. For future reference, when you're gossiping about someone at a party, you might want to make sure they're not standing close enough to hear every word, especially when you're calling them pathetic and claiming they're living in the past. The color drained from Vanessa's face completely, and Richard looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. Because here's the thing about the past, I said. Sometimes the past you're mocking contains skills and knowledge and resources that the present hasn't even begun to understand. Sometimes the woman you dismissed as irrelevant has been quietly building an empire while you were busy spending someone else's money and feeling superior. I handed the microphone back to the wedding coordinator and walked back to my table while the ballroom erupted in whispered conversations and shocked reactions. Emma stood up from the head table and made her way through the crowd to where I was sitting. Mom, she said, tears streaming down her face, is this real? The collection, the trust fund, all of it? It's real, sweetheart, I said, hugging my daughter. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner, but I needed you to know me as your mother, not as someone with money. I needed our relationship to be authentic. But why now? Why tell everyone like this? Because your father's wife has spent the past 8 months treating me like I was a charity case who should be grateful for their generosity. Because I'm tired of being underestimated by people who mistake quiet strength for weakness. And because I wanted you to know, on your wedding day, that you come from a line of strong women who build their own success rather than depending on someone else to provide it. David had joined us, looking slightly overwhelmed by the revelation. Mrs. Harper, he said, I had no idea. Emma never mentioned that you were a major art collector. Emma didn't know, I said. I kept my professional life very separate from my personal life, but I think it's time to stop hiding what I've accomplished. The rest of the reception passed in a blur of shocked conversations and curious questions. Richard and Vanessa had disappeared shortly after my speech, presumably to process the fact that the woman they'd been condescending to for months was actually wealthier than they were. Several guests approached me to ask about my collection and the upcoming exhibition, their attitudes noticeably different from the polite dismissal I'd received earlier in the evening. But the real fallout didn't begin until the next morning. I was sitting in my apartment, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper when my phone started ringing. The first call came from Marcus Brennan, my art dealer, and his voice contained a mixture of excitement and concern. Catherine, he said, I don't know what you did at that wedding yesterday, but my phone has been ringing off the hook since 7:00 this morning. Everyone wants to know about the Harper collection and the upcoming exhibition. Good, I said, that was the point. The Portland Art Museum called. They want to discuss a possible partnership for the exhibition. The Oregonian wants to do a feature story. And I've had inquiries from at least 6 serious collectors who are interested in viewing or purchasing pieces from your collection. Set up the meetings, I said. It's time the Catherine Harper collection got the recognition it deserves. The second call came from Emma, and she sounded shaken. Mom, Dad called this morning. He's furious about your speech. He says you humiliated him and Vanessa in front of his professional colleagues. I told the truth, I said calmly. If the truth is humiliating, perhaps they should examine their own behavior. He's saying you planned this whole thing as revenge for the divorce. That you've been hiding money that should have been part of the settlement. I felt anger spike through me. Emma, I built my collection before, during, and after my marriage to your father. Every piece was purchased with money I earned through my own work, kept in accounts that were always separate from our marital finances. Your father has no legal or moral claim to any of it. I know, Mom. I believe you. It's just, this is a lot to process. Why didn't you ever tell me you were successful? Why let everyone think you were just getting by? Because I wanted you to love me for who I am, not what I own, I said. And because I learned during my marriage to your father that people treat you very differently when they know you have money. I wanted authentic relationships, not people who valued me for my bank account. Emma was quiet for a moment. Vanessa called too. She's claiming you made up the whole thing about overhearing her at the party, that you're lying to make her look bad. I have no reason to lie, I said. And I suspect several of her friends who were standing nearby remember the conversation quite clearly. People tend to remember when someone makes cruel comments about other people. The third call came from Richard himself, and his voice was tight with barely controlled rage. Catherine, we need to talk about your little performance yesterday. You had no right to embarrass Vanessa, and me like that in front of our friends and colleagues. I had every right to respond to months of condescension and disrespect, I said. You and your wife spent the entire engagement period treating me like I was a poor relation you were graciously tolerating. You made assumptions about my financial situation and my capabilities, and those assumptions were wrong. You deliberately deceived us, Richard accused. You let us believe you were struggling financially when you were actually sitting on millions of dollars. That's fraud. It's not fraud to maintain privacy about my financial affairs, I countered. I never asked for your charity or your pity. You offered it based on your own assumptions, and I simply didn't correct those assumptions because I wanted to see who you really were when you thought you had all the power. This is about revenge, Richard said. You're still bitter about the divorce, and you're using Emma's wedding to get back at me. This has nothing to do with our divorce, I said, though that wasn't entirely true. This has to do with respect. You and Vanessa treated me with contempt because you thought I was powerless. You made cruel comments and condescending offers of help because you believed I had no other options. I simply showed you that your beliefs were wrong. You've made Vanessa look foolish in front of her entire social circle, Richard said. She's devastated. Vanessa made herself look foolish by gossiping about me at your party, I replied. I simply provided context for her comments. If she's embarrassed, it's because her own words came back to haunt her. I want you to issue a public retraction, Richard demanded. Tell people you exaggerated about the collection's value. Admit that you planned this whole thing to humiliate us. I'm not going to do that, I said calmly, because it would be a lie. The collection is worth exactly what I said it's worth, probably more by now given current market trends. And the only people who should be humiliated are the ones who made cruel assumptions about someone they barely knew. Richard was silent for a long moment. You've changed, Catherine. You used to be kind and accommodating. Now you're just bitter and vindictive. No, Richard, I said. I've always been exactly who I am. The difference is that I'm no longer willing to make myself smaller to make you feel bigger. That's not bitterness. That's growth. I hung up before he could respond, feeling more liberated than I'd felt in years. The week after Emma's wedding was a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and negotiations that transformed my quiet private life into something much more public. Marcus had arranged a meeting with the Portland Art Museum to discuss a collaborative exhibition featuring selected pieces from my collection. The museum's director, Dr. Sarah Chen, greeted me in her office with the kind of professional respect I'd been missing from Richard and Vanessa's interactions. Mrs. Harper, she said, I have to admit, I'm somewhat embarrassed that the museum wasn't aware of your collection until now. You've been operating right under our noses for 20 years. I preferred to keep a low profile, I said, but circumstances have changed, and I think it's time to share what I've built with a wider audience. We spent 2 hours discussing potential exhibition formats, insurance requirements, and scholarly cataloging of the collection. Dr. Chen was particularly interested in my early acquisitions of works by artists who'd gone on to achieve major recognition. Your eye for emerging talent is remarkable, she said, reviewing my acquisition records. You were buying works by artists who are now in major museum collections, often years before the market recognized their significance. I trusted my instincts, I said, and I did my research. I spent years studying contemporary art movements, attending gallery openings, talking to artists about their influences and intentions. I built relationships rather than just buying names. That's evident in the collection, Dr. Chen agreed. This isn't just valuable art, it's a carefully curated representation of contemporary art evolution over 2 decades. It tells a story. The Oregonian interview was scheduled for later that week, and the reporter, Amanda Torres, arrived at my apartment with a photographer and a list of questions that went far beyond simple art appreciation. Mrs. Harper, she began, once we'd settled in my living room surrounded by several pieces from my collection, your revelation at your daughter's wedding has created quite a stir in Portland's social circles. Some people are calling it the most dramatic wedding speech in recent memory. I wasn't trying to be dramatic, I said. I was simply correcting some misconceptions. Misconceptions about your financial situation? Misconceptions about who I am and what I'm capable of, I clarified. For the past 10 years since my divorce, people have made assumptions about my life based on very limited information. They saw a divorced woman working as an art consultant and assumed I was struggling. They saw someone who lived modestly and assumed I had no other options. Amanda leaned forward, clearly interested. But you did have other options. You had millions of dollars in art assets. Why live modestly if you didn't have to? Because modest living gave me freedom, I explained. When people think you're wealthy, they treat you differently. They want things from you, access to your resources, social connections, financial support. By maintaining a modest public profile, I was able to build authentic relationships with people who valued me for who I was rather than what I owned. Including your daughter? Especially my daughter. I wanted Emma to know me as her mother, not as a wealthy collector. I wanted our relationship to be based on love and respect, not financial dependency. The photographer had been quietly documenting our conversation, and now he asked if he could photograph me with some of the collection pieces. We spent the next hour arranging shots that would accompany the article, images of me standing beside paintings and sculptures that represented 20 years of careful acquisition and patient investment. Mrs. Harper, Amanda said as we wrapped up, there's been some speculation that your wedding speech was motivated by revenge against your ex-husband and his new wife. How do you respond to that? I considered the question carefully. Revenge implies that I did something to hurt them. I simply told the truth about my own accomplishments. If that truth is uncomfortable for people who've been underestimating me, that's a consequence of their own assumptions, not my revenge. But you must have known that revealing your wealth publicly would embarrass them, especially after they'd positioned themselves as your financial superiors. I knew it would surprise them, I admitted. But embarrassment comes from being exposed doing something wrong. All I exposed was their tendency to make assumptions and their willingness to treat people with condescension based on those assumptions. If they're embarrassed, it's because they're confronting their own behavior. The article ran the following Sunday, taking up most of the arts and culture section with photographs of my collection and a detailed account of how I'd built one of the region's most significant private art holdings while maintaining complete anonymity. The headline read, "The Secret Collector: How Portland's Hidden Art Maven Built a $12 million collection while everyone assumed she was broke." The response was immediate and overwhelming. My phone rang constantly with calls from galleries, museums, collectors, and journalists wanting to know more about the Catherine Harper collection. Social invitations arrived from organizations that had never acknowledged my existence before. And perhaps most satisfyingly, I received a formal apology from the country club, where Emma's reception had been held, explaining that they'd had no idea they were hosting someone of my stature in the art world. But the real satisfaction came from watching how the revelation affected Richard and Vanessa's social standing. I didn't have to do anything to damage their reputation. The story did that all by itself. Within days, word had spread through Portland's social circles that Richard's ex-wife, the woman Vanessa had publicly mocked as pathetic and living in the past, was actually wealthier and more successful than both of them combined. The gossip was delicious, from what I heard through mutual acquaintances. Vanessa's friends were reportedly asking why she'd been so cruel to someone who clearly didn't deserve it. Richard's professional colleagues were questioning his judgment in allowing his wife to publicly insult the mother of his daughter. And both of them were facing the uncomfortable reality that their condescension had been based on completely false assumptions. Emma called me 3 weeks after the wedding, and her voice contained a mixture of emotions I couldn't quite identify. Mom, I need to talk to you about something. Can I come over? She arrived an hour later with David, both of them looking serious. We sat in my living room, surrounded by art that Emma was seeing with new eyes, and she took a deep breath before speaking. I've been thinking a lot about your speech and everything that's happened since the wedding, she began, and I realized that I've been complicit in how Dad and Vanessa treated you. I let them position themselves as the important parents while you were pushed to the sidelines. I didn't speak up when Vanessa made condescending comments about your life. I just wanted everyone to get along, and I sacrificed your dignity to keep the peace. Emma, I started, but she held up her hand. Please let me finish. I'm ashamed of how I behaved. You're my mother. You raised me alone while Dad was building his career. You supported my dreams, paid for my education, and loved me unconditionally. And I repaid you by allowing other people to treat you like you didn't matter. Tears were streaming down her face, and I moved to sit beside her on the couch. I had no idea about the collection or the trust fund or any of it, she continued. But that's not the point. The point is that I should have defended you regardless of your bank account. Your worth as my mother has nothing to do with how much money you have. Sweetheart, I said gently, you were trying to navigate an impossible situation. I don't blame you for wanting your wedding day to be peaceful. But it shouldn't have been impossible, Emma insisted. It was only impossible because Dad and Vanessa made it that way with their arrogance and their assumptions, and I enabled them by not standing up for you. David spoke for the first time. Mrs. Harper, Emma and I have been talking about the trust fund you established. It's an incredibly generous gift, and we're grateful beyond words. But we want you to know that we're not accepting it because we need the money. We're accepting it because it represents your love and your desire to give Emma independence. That means more to us than the actual dollars. I smiled at my son-in-law, appreciating his understanding. That's exactly why I created it. I wanted Emma to know that she has choices, that she never has to stay in a situation or relationship because she's financially dependent on someone else's goodwill. Like you were dependent on Dad during your marriage? Emma asked quietly. I was never actually dependent on your father, I said. I always had my own income from my artwork. But I learned during that marriage how financial power can be used to control people, how someone can make you feel small by controlling the purse strings. I didn't want that for you. We talked for hours that afternoon, and I explained how I'd built the collection, why I'd kept it private, and what I hoped Emma would learn from the whole experience. By the time they left, I felt like my relationship with my daughter had shifted to something deeper and more honest than it had been before. The exhibition opening at the Portland Art Museum was scheduled for 6 weeks after Emma's wedding, and Marcus had worked with Dr. Chen to create something truly special. The show was titled 20 Years of Vision, the Catherine Harper Collection, and it featured 45 carefully selected pieces that represented the breadth and depth of my acquisitions. The opening night was invitation only, and the guest list read like a who's who of the Pacific Northwest art world. Collectors, curators, artists, critics, and cultural leaders filled the museum galleries, examining my collection with the kind of serious attention it had never received while sitting quietly in my apartment. I wore a dress for the occasion that finally reflected my actual status rather than my carefully maintained modest image. It was elegant and expensive, purchased specifically to signal that Catherine Harper was no longer hiding her success. Marcus found me standing in front of one of my favorite pieces, a large abstract painting I'd acquired in 2007 for $45,000 that was now valued at over $800,000. Catherine, he said, I don't think I've ever seen an opening generate this much excitement. Everyone wants to know how you developed such an extraordinary eye for emerging talent. I trusted myself, I said simply. I stopped listening to people who told me I didn't understand art or business or investment. I studied, I learned, I made careful choices, and I was patient enough to let those choices mature. The evening progressed with speeches from Dr. Chen and several prominent critics who praised the collection's significance. Then it was my turn to address the assembled guests. Thank you all for being here tonight, I began, looking out at a room full of people who were finally seeing me as I truly was. This collection represents 20 years of passion, study, and strategic investment. But more than that, it represents something I learned about the power of being underestimated. I paused, letting that sink in. You see, for most of these 20 years, people assumed I was just a hobbyist, someone who dabbled in art without really understanding it. They assumed I was living a small life with small ambitions. And I let them believe that, because it gave me freedom to work without interference or judgment. But recently, I learned that being underestimated can have costs as well as benefits. When people assume you're powerless, they feel free to treat you with disrespect. They make cruel comments and condescending offers of help because they believe you have no other options. Several people in the audience shifted uncomfortably, and I wondered if Vanessa had heard about the exhibition and was somewhere nursing her wounded pride. So I decided it was time to stop being invisible. Time to show what I'd built while everyone was busy assuming I hadn't built anything at all. This exhibition is my way of saying that quiet doesn't mean weak, modest doesn't mean poor, and patience doesn't mean powerless. The applause that followed felt like vindication for every condescending comment, every patronizing assumption, every moment when someone had treated me like I didn't matter. After my speech, I was surrounded by people wanting to discuss the collection, my acquisition strategy, and my plans for future exhibitions. It was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. That's when I saw Richard and Vanessa enter the gallery, looking uncomfortable and out of place among the art world elite. They approached me slowly, and I could see the effort it cost Vanessa to maintain her composure. "Catherine," Richard said stiffly, "congratulations on the exhibition, it's quite impressive." "Thank you," I said, matching his formal tone. Vanessa looked like she wanted to be anywhere else, but she forced a smile. "I had no idea you were so accomplished in the art world. If I'd known, I never would have, that is, I'm sorry if I said anything that might have seemed insensitive." If she'd known, if her comments might have seemed insensitive. Not a real apology, just damage control. "Vanessa," I said quietly, "the problem wasn't that you didn't know about my collection. The problem was that you made cruel assumptions about my life and my worth based on superficial observations. You didn't need to know about my bank account to treat me with basic respect." She flinched, and Richard put a protective hand on her arm. "Catherine, I think we've all learned some lessons from this situation," he said. "Perhaps we can move forward with better understanding." "Perhaps," I agreed. "Though I think the real lesson is that you should never underestimate people based on your own limited perspective. You assumed I was living in the past because I wasn't living the kind of flashy, expensive lifestyle you value. But the truth is, I was building a future while you were busy showing off your present." They left shortly after, and I returned to my conversations with people who actually appreciated what I'd accomplished. The exhibition ran for 3 months and was reviewed in major art publications across the country. Several pieces sold for record prices, and I was approached about loaning works to other museums for their exhibitions. The Catherine Harper collection had gone from complete obscurity to regional significance in a matter of weeks. But the most satisfying moment came 6 months after the exhibition, when Emma called to tell me she was pregnant. "Mom," she said, her voice bright with joy, "you're going to be a grandmother. And I want you to know that this baby is going to grow up knowing their grandmother as the strong, successful, amazing woman you really are. Not the modest version you showed the world for so long, but the real you." "Thank you, sweetheart," I said, feeling tears prick my eyes. "That means more to me than any exhibition or collection value ever could. And Mom, I want to thank you for teaching me something important. You showed me that real strength doesn't come from showing off or putting other people down. It comes from knowing your own worth and not needing external validation to feel successful." As I hung up the phone, I looked around my apartment at the remaining pieces from my collection, the ones I'd kept for personal enjoyment rather than public display. Each one represented a moment of trust in my own judgment, a decision to invest in beauty and meaning rather than just following what other people said was valuable. Richard and Vanessa had thought they were superior because they lived in a big house and drove expensive cars and belonged to exclusive clubs. But they'd built their lives on appearances and debt, while I'd quietly built something real and lasting. They'd thought my past was something to mock, evidence of a life that hadn't lived up to its potential. But that past had contained skills and knowledge and patience that had created a future they never saw coming. The past they'd laughed at had come back to haunt them, not with revenge or cruelty, but with truth. And sometimes, truth is the most devastating weapon of all. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.